Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all here. Again, thanks for joining us from wherever you are. Today is April 3rd, 2025, and it is our 10th and last seminar in this series, the series titled History of People, Forest, and Forestry. My name is Gary Dunning. I'm the Executive Director of the Forest School and the Forest Dialogue here at Yale, based at the Yale School of the Environment. And I think, as everybody knows by now, I am also joined in hosting duties by Professor Mark Ashton from the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment and Tanya Muntz from the Forest History Society. So as always, thanks to both of them and to the organizations that they are with for supporting the series. We're gonna start pretty quickly today because we got a lot to cover. And as it is our last webinar in this series, I urge you all to stay on until the last, because I will then share the two new series that we'll be launching in the fall. So please stay on until the end to hear about the new series starting in the fall. All right, without any further discussion, let me introduce our final speaker for the series, Dr. Karl Appuhn. Karl is an associate professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, where he teaches. Karl's research focuses on environmental history of early modern Europe generally, and of Venice, Italy more specifically. He is most interested in the ways, that scientific and political institutions, social practices, and technology mediate the relationship between people and the natural world. He is the author of A Forest on the Sea, Environmental Expertise in Renaissance Venice. That's available from Johns Hopkins with a date of 2009. Karl's talk today is titled How to Count and Map Trees in Early Modern Venice, the Political Values of Precision. And with that very short introduction, I'm happy to hand it over to you, Karl. Please go ahead and share your presentation, and we look forward.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Okay, starting with a blank slide. All right, so I'm really excited to be here today and to have the chance to talk about forests with this particular audience. So a little bit, just under 30 years ago, when I was a graduate student and I decided to start working on Renaissance Venice's forest management system, one of the things I was told to do, and of course this was sort of in the early moments of email, was to write to someone at Yale Forest School and ask for a syllabus. So I did, and that reading list helped get me up to speed on how forestry is practiced in the modern world, and also because I wanted to be more familiar with some of the technical issues so that I wouldn't end up sounding wrong when I started writing about them. So it feels kind of like a nice way to close the loop on that nearly 30 years later. And, I'm not working on forests right now. I will explain at the end of my talk what I'm doing. But the book that did come out of that dissertation is, as Gary mentioned, A Forest on the Sea, and that is not 30 years old. It's only, frighteningly, about 15 years old. It came out at the end, very, very end of 2009. And in that book, I traced the long history of Venice's involvement with mainland forests. And Venice needed forest products of all descriptions, firewood and charcoal to burn, for household use, for energy, construction timber to hold the city up. If those of you who don't know, most of Venice is built on landfill, and it's basically larch and oak piles that were driven into landfill that actually hold the whole city up. It's an enormous number of trees that are under there, and so part of the title of the book was a pun about that. And of course, most famously high quality timber for shipbuilding. And Venice was a major center of trade, and all of its merchant fleet was built in Venice at state expense. And this map here is just a map that shows where most of those forest reserves were. And the one that's way up in the mountains in Aronzo was a fir reserve for mass timbers. The really large one that's near Alpago, called the Cancillo, was beach, which they needed for oars. Most of the ships they built were galleys. But then what really mattered were the oak reserves, which were all down in mostly in the plain. And the biggest one is the one that's marked there, the Montello forest. So beginning with a single forest in 1463, and it is that Montello forest, the public forest system rapidly expanded until it encompassed well over 50 separate forests and forest reserves, stretching in a band from Padua, which is over on the left side of the map, all the way to the Istrian Peninsula, what's today Slovenia and Croatia. And the forests that I'm going to talk about today were really scattered all over. It wasn't one single reserve. It was more than 50. Most of these forests were oak, as I mentioned, and there were two major exceptions. The Vice di Cadore and the Bosco del Cancillo. Most of the forests were concentrated, as I said, in the coastal plain, and they were of varying size and density. In 1569, which is the year that they do the first comprehensive survey, there were 25 different state-controlled oak reserves in the area between the Piave and the Livenza River, which are, you'll see, is actually a fairly small area. It's that narrow band. Most of the really high-quality timber came down the Piave River, including the largest, the Montello. State reserves in the Trevigiano alone contained well over 400,000 Durmast oak of varying sizes, while forests in the region around Asolo contained in excess of 150,000 by their count, oak trees. The Asolo reserves were particularly highly regarded, and the first Venetian surveyor to enter the area described them, quote, as more miraculous than natural, unquote. And the arsenal managers, the arsenal is the shipbuilding center in Venice, only resorted to those forests in moments of pressing need, usually when they had to gear up for war. Policing the public forests presented Renaissance Venetian state with a pretty wide range of practical and administrative challenges, and the Venetians met these challenges by creating a bureaucracy staffed to the extent possible by experts and providing them, and that has a fuzzy meaning, but I'll get into that in a second, providing them with a set of rational tools for monitoring and managing forests. Now, the meaning of expertise changes in really significant ways. In the 15th century, for example, the Senate, which is the main legislative body in Venice was a republic. It often found itself turning to timber merchants to run this bureaucracy. And while such men had the advantage of knowing something about forests, they were also often seen with a certain amount of suspicion because their private interests were obviously in conflict with public duty. And by the end of the century, this starts to remedy itself in a couple of ways. One is that the timber merchants who live in Venice, for the most part, and Gigi Corazzola has written about this in the last 5 years, as part of a family strategy, relocate onto the mainland. So they take themselves out of running for these positions. And so by the middle of the 16th century, by the middle of the 1500s, the profile of the expert, what counted as an expert, had definitively changed. Rather than familiarity with the trade, the state sought administrative experience in timber producing areas. So these areas that are marked on the map. So between 1550 and 1690, nearly 70% of the managers elected by the Senate, they were always elected, had served at least one term as a local governor in a timber producing area early on in their political careers. After 1569, they were also required to have served at least one prior term as the elected head of the shipbuilding center, the arsenal. So the skills that were associated with expertise had changed. The creation of this group of experts reached beyond Venice's politically enfranchised class. Many of the new experts in these fields of what we call environmental management were drawn from the citizen class. It's a privileged group of people who had status but didn't have franchise. They couldn't vote, who were but they were the backbone of the Venetian bureaucracy, all of the Venetian bureaucracy. Elected patrician supervisors came and went, but the citizens were the permanent managerial class. In the field of lagoon management, for example, it was usually a citizen who made the critical decisions about which sections of breakwater to shore up or to extend. In forest management, the supervisors, the patrician electeds, relied on their citizen secretaries, they were usually called, to monitor inspection teams, supervise work crews, and process the ever-increasing mountain of quantitative data that were gathered during periodic cadastral surveys of the public reserves. The view that patrician experts had of forest management was profoundly shaped by their former service. As young governors, one of their main challenges would have been to preserve state prerogatives in the face of powerful local interests, usually powerful families. And these families were increasingly allied sometimes with powerful families back in Venice, who by the late 16th century had invested heavily in mainland property. And in timber-producing areas, especially the ones on the map, private interests most often came into conflict with state interest over the issue of forest exploitation. Who got to go in, who got to cut, who got to use. As a consequence, a handful of young governors developed an obsession with protecting public forests, these state reserves, which were different from privately owned forests or they weren't commons. They weren't, although some of them were built out of existing commons, they had a special and separate juridical status. With protecting these forests from the abuse of local merchants and the agents of powerful patrician families back in Venice. And these were moral qualities and practical experience, both, and the Senate selected for these qualities when appointing Approvvigitore Sopraboschi, the manager of forests, from the mid-16th century to the end of the 18th. They shared, in a word, a worldview about what it meant to manage forest resources, and this was a traditional Venetian vision shaped by centuries of managing the balance between silt and salt water in the lagoon. It might be best summarized by a 1413 anonymous author on the lagoon who held that the exploitation of nature, this is a quote, for purely private gain is against nature, was unnatural. And this was an ethos that led Venetians to a particular set of conclusions about how the human capacity to transform the environment ought to be applied. So to be brief, they viewed imitation of nature as the greatest good, although what that meant in practice was pretty fuzzy. But for forestry, what it meant was that they understood forest management as largely antithetical to agriculture. Silviculture, to use the modern term, was not the framework here. It's quite different from the emerging practices in German-speaking Europe that would form the basis of modern forestry regimes. And those usually increasingly viewed the human capacity to utterly transform nature as something that could and should be applied as widely as possible. But Venice shied away from this. So one way to see how this difference played out in practical terms is to examine the technologies of environmental control that Venetian forestry experts and their underlings created to monitor and control not just public forests, but especially public forests in both time and space, and the uses to which these technologies were put. And of course, the two most important technologies were mapping, space, including but not limited to topographical maps, as I'll talk about in a second, and a set of quantitative tools that would theoretically allow Venetian officials to track the timber reserves at the level of the individual tree over time. And effective enforcement of regulations depended heavily on the ability of officials to accurately monitor changes in stands between inspections. So for the managers, it was a question of seeing these forests across time. And as I'll talk about in a minute, not everybody shared that understanding. So over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, the techniques employed by Venetian officials to chart the size and shape of forests evolved dramatically. And we can divide these techniques into two separate but related categories. I'll talk about mapping first. So boundary marking and cartography, which I want to talk about separately. So the simplest form of boundary marking involved digging ditches at the perimeter of the forest or certain sections of the forest. These were to prevent livestock from getting into the woods. Their perspective, it created a permanent record of the boundaries of individual stands so that any change ought to be immediately evident during subsequent inspections. And then this was soon followed by a more elaborate system of surveying and marking the boundaries of the forest to protect stands from human incursion, particularly the expansion of arable land, fields through clear cutting, or even worse, from the perspective of Venice, burning. Initially, inspectors employed a system of descriptive mapping, and this involved detailed narratives. So there's no picture here. It's just a story that tells you, sometimes these things go on for pages and pages, in incredible detail, how to walk the perimeter of a particular stand. And these descriptive maps don't get replaced by topographical maps. They remain in use even after the introduction of topographical maps in the 17th century. And in fact, they were usually used in tandem with such representative maps. So the map and the description sit together in the archive. And then they used other techniques, stone survey markers, and they did land surveying, measuring distance and orientation and so on. So I'll show you a couple of examples. This is a pretty early example of what's going to become a kind of topographic map. And you can see this one's from 1610. The date is right there. The map orientations are indicated. So the P on the left side is Ponente, or west. So this is a map that's oriented north. There's a scale, but the forest itself is also rendered with a certain kind of artistic flourish, let's say. And it also, for example, that this particular state forest actually surrounds a larger area associated with this town, the Villa de Javra, and that is a commons. And so what you see in this case is that the commons is inside, so they're concerned about the commons encroaching, but the forest also acts as a kind of buffer against private interests who might want to privatize the commons. And then you see sometimes they have these charming details. So this one, for example, in the bottom left, you'll see that this one is actually oriented upside down. So north is down towards the bottom right, but they kind of literalize what this is by the picture of the compass and the table. So it's sort of, this is how the map is going to be seen. This is what the map gives you. It gives you measurements. It gives you precision, at least the illusion of precision. And you'll see that in this case now, the trees are just kind of rendered as dots. Sometimes the cartographers have a less elegant hand in this case, but again, you can see the compass indicating the scale on the map. You still have the orientation, and you have in the bottom left this just simply verbal account of where this is. And then the description of how to walk the perimeter would be on the following pages. And this is one that's one of my favorites. This is an early 18th century one, and this is Bosco di San Marco. San Marco, St. Mark, was the patron saint of Venice. The left side of that road that runs through the reserve, and B, how many are on the other side. And you'll notice that there are different numbers, and those actually indicate how many trees are ready for harvesting. And then my favorite little detail is the maniculum. That's the pointing finger up there in the top middle. And that actually serves a purpose. If you turn the page and you go to the descriptive map that tells you how to walk this perimeter, you start right at the marker where that maniculum is pointing. And then all the words around the outside are the names of the private landowners whose land abuts So you can also see that there's kind of uh, you could see this as an act of suspicion. You could see this as an act of record keeping, but there is an effort to keep track of this so that if there are changes, you'll know that it's the Fontana family or the Melori family, uh, or San Valentino, which actually that part belongs to a convent, and so on. You also see other kinds of maps, and these descriptive and illustrated maps track changes. And this is of that beech forest, the Cancillo. And what's interesting about this one is it's not aiming for topographical accuracy, but each one of those little placards indicates the coops into which the forest has been divided by the state. And the idea would be obviously to harvest beech in each coop in successive years. And so maps can indicate a lot of different things. And this one I particularly like. It's an early 17th century one because it also has embedded in it certain kinds of expert information, how to judge which tree to, because these have to become ores. You don't want the ones with lots of branches lower down, the C poles, because those are going to have knots and they're going to be weaker. There are instructions on how to quarter saw. It contains not just sort of information about the place, but information about the trees themselves. And here again is that coop map, but now represented graphically, and you can actually turn the hand points to the coop that's going to be used this year, and then on the opposite side you see the same thing. And then this thing actually spins. It's a little lunar calendar for determining when to start harvesting in the fall for optimum conditions in the river for floating this stuff downstream. Okay, I'll take that off for now. Descriptive and illustrated maps track changes in the forest in really new ways. And more importantly, though, they reveal one of the main preoccupations had. And that preoccupation can be summarized as preserving total forested area. They're concerned about the boundaries. The contrast with Northern European foresters in the 17th and 18th centuries subtle, but it's essential. German and French foresters in this period also began to employ maps to keep track of the forest under the control, but they didn't share the same obsession with the boundaries. They were more obsessed with what was inside. They were content with the approximate quality of the topographic map because it is approximate, whereas this thing of matching the map to the descriptive map is about creating precision or the image of precision. And that's why Venice keeps using those descriptive maps even after other places have abandoned them by the end of the 18th century. And that same desire for precision can be seen in the quantitative tools they employed to track changes in the composition of each individual forest. They began to gather this information at the level of the individual tree, beginning in 1569, oak trees in state reserves, but not just in common lands, in ecclesiastical property, in private property, were marked according to their eventual end use. Trees were placed into categories of circumference, age, potential for growth. It was the task, and shape too, that was important as well. It was the task for which the Proditori Sopraboschi were elected. And the Proditori would head up a survey team made up of citizen secretaries and at least one cartographer, local guides, stonemasons to set the survey markers, arsenal masters who were experienced at judging quality, and then people who would go out into the forest with bags full of marbles of different colors that indicated trees of different circumference. And as they counted, they would just move marbles from one bag into a big empty bag. And at the end of the day, they would empty it out, count the marbles, and bingo, you have the exact number, or as close as you can get to the number of trees in the stand. And then as they counted, they would burn permanent marks onto them. The taxonomies they employed grew in sophistication. By the 17th century, they cataloged more than just arsenal oak that didn't meet the necessary quality for naval construction could still be used as piles. Construction timber for public works, and in some cases, even if it was particularly low quality for charcoal production, and these things were marked accordingly. They conduct the first big comprehensive account in 1569, and then from there on, they repeat the process approximately every 20 years. And they don't do another comprehensive one, but they survey something every 20 years. And the surveys combine this new mapping, the new mapping tools that I showed you, with this kind of raw quantitative data that was being assembled as they marked. And every oak tree in the Venetian state was counted. And it's kind of actually insane. Folio registers. And the striking thing when you open them is that they marked every oak tree, even trees along the side of the road. There's one tree in the piazza in Pordenone, and you can watch this tree grow over decades because they went and recorded its existence. Trees in windbreaks, in gardens, everywhere. They were all accounted for. They were all recorded. Every piece of property containing even one oak was registered according to ownership and jurisdiction, and then the maps were appended dutifully. Trees were listed according to size, quality, distance to nearest navigable river, and so on. Now, in practice, it's impossible to keep these kinds of records up to date, but they pretended that they were. In contrast to, say, 18th century German foresters who would extrapolate the composition of forests based on a statistical sample taken in a small area, and then they would just multiply it across, Venetians insisted on counting every single tree all the way up until 1792, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And they insisted on counting in this way, not because they were ignorant of extrapolation. They knew how to do it. There's actually a text in 1570 that explains the advantages of extrapolating from small samples, and even debates whether or not to adopt the practice, but ultimately it rejects the technique because it's not precise enough. They want a precise catalog of crucial resources. And you can kind of see the same logic in other environmental management projects, such as in the 1620s, they undertook a survey of the lagoon, the conterminazione lagunare, and they wanted to precisely chart the boundaries to prevent neighboring landowners from engaging in surreptitious reclamation. What does it all mean? When someone consulted one of these giant registers of quantitative data or looked at a topographical map, what did they think they were seeing? Who was all of that precision for? Or to put it a different way, what was the story that was being told? And one of the main arguments of the book was that all this information told different stories depending on who was reading it. Even if everyone evinced faith in whatever story they read into them, the stories they read were different. Legislators in the Ducal Palace believed that the gross counts reflected the real state of mainland oak forests. So they saw it as static. They didn't actually see it as a question of forest changing over time. They just thought this was a picture of how things are. The arsenal managers often took a similarly short-term view of the data. Their biggest interest was where to cut, where to harvest. And they relied on this, even if sometimes the information was 20 years or more out of date. That's what they used to decide where. Again, the potential of the cadastral survey to describe time was largely lost. By contrast, the forest managers, the provveditori sopraboschi, saw the surveys as a way of evaluating changes that over time. They understood the data in each individual survey as an accurate picture of a specific place at a specific moment, not a true representation of the overall condition of forests. They were responsible for telling a story of precision through pictures and numbers, but they didn't trust that story. And the data from past surveys provided them with a useful set of tools for evaluating information as it became available. Comparing data across two or more surveys allowed them to develop a vision of mainland forests as constantly shifting, as a landscape in flux. In other words, the quantitative data helped one category of expert formulate a new narrative about important changes to the land. Traditional surveys had offered both an explicit narrative descriptions of what the surveys had seen, as well as an implicit narrative of environmental decline. So every time a forest shrinks, the people back in Venice see this as uh, as degradation, as decline. And the cadastral surveys provided a new basis for constructing, at least for the managers, a convincing narrative about changes that wasn't one that was based on ideas of decline. Rather than rely on traditional accounts of what was happening and why, the new surveys provided these officials with presumptively precise empirical information, and these narratives proved convincing to Venetians at all levels of the state precisely because everyone believed that they were grounded in empirically verified information. And because the one thing that Venice feared, and it's the earliest mentions of forests go back to the 14th century in the Venetian archive, and the very first sentence that was written about forests was, because we are running out of timber. They formulated the narratives that they formulated based on their interpretation of these data tended again towards these images of decline in which forest resources were disappearing, and mainland residents, whether poor or rich, were the villains. This view of the data was most often on display in the courtroom, and there are lots of court cases where they prosecute individuals and sometimes institutions for abuse of the forest. And however, as the surveys multiplied and successive generations of Provveditori Sopravoschi ventured out into the mainland in the company of all of their subordinate experts to count, to map, to do things, a new narrative began to take shape. And according to this interpretation of the story, that the numbers were telling them, or they thought the numbers were telling them, the Republic could safeguard and even increase its forest patrimony through the application of a well-planned program of forest management that included regular maintenance of important stands and consistent enforcement of legislation. But this narrative undermined the idea that the point of all of this was to preserve the total forested area. That's job one. And that was the master narrative that affected how most people saw it. So rather, this new story suggested that low-value forests, especially ones that didn't produce large amounts of construction material, the ones that had 1 or 2 or 3 trees in them, oak trees among in a mixed stand, those could be cleared or at least significantly reduced without cost. Older concerns about erosion and sedimentation downstream still governed management of areas close to rivers, but for forests further away, most forest managers attempted to convince legislators that it would be fine to just leave them alone, leave them to local management, focusing the attention of the state only on what really mattered, what was most valuable. It was a story that would have brought Venice into closer alignment with emerging practices north of the Alps, but it was also a story that failed to convince decision makers they preferred the old story, in part because it was easier to see in the maps and surveys, but more importantly because it aligned with a set of traditional Venetian concerns about environmental management that can best be summarized versus via this 18th century image that appears as a frontispiece for a text on lagoon management. And here you can see water and earth struggling for control of the lagoon. Venice is in the background. And the point of human intervention here is to maintain this perfect state of equipoise. That's to say that the idea was to keep things just exactly as they were. If human action tilted the scale in favor of one or the other, the lagoon and the city would either become terrestrialized or inundated. Either way, Venice would no longer be Venice. And the same logic governed the interpretations of the maps and the surveys. The point was to keep things as they were, not change them by chasing the illusion of better yields or increased efficiency. And because erosion and fluvial sedimentation connected the lagoon to the forest, the static vision prevailed, or at least it did until 1792, when the Senate approved a new system of departments based on a French model. But we don't know what happened there because in 1797, Napoleon conquers Venice, sells it to Austria, and then for the next half century, Venice is traded back and forth between France and Austria until finally it was absorbed into the new unified Italian state in 1866. So all of that reform goes for naught. Now, I just want to conclude with a couple of remarks. Now, it's interesting for me to revisit this because the book's now 15 years old. I'm working on the history of veterinary medicine now. still in the Venetian mainland, still in the same period. But what I can actually see is that I missed something, a certain aspect of the 18th century story that I hadn't noticed before. And in particular, my focus on the politics of the metropole, or what you might call a metronormative perspective, led me to share in some of the same blind spots as my historical actors. The story I told, based on the data and the maps and the laws and the reports and the surveys, was different from the story that they told, but it still was a metropolitan story. It still gave short shrift to a different vision of these landscapes that was taking hold, starting really in about the 1750s. And I'll explain why I didn't see this. Part of it is location. The vision took shape in a new set of institutions, agrarian academies that were situated in mainland cities and where they debated agrarian reform. And remember, for Venice, forests and agriculture were antithetical, so it didn't occur to me that that would be a place to look. The membership of these academies included a new bourgeois elite in these cities, physicians, notaries, lawyers, alongside representatives of large landowning institutions or large landowners. The impetus was a series of famines that occurred in the middle of the 18th century on the Italian peninsula. And even though Venice was the least affected, the academics in these institutions sought solutions to what they perceived as a productive crisis. It's a supply problem. Many of their solutions focused on increasing the production, not just of cereal crops, but of meat, which meant a complete reevaluation from their perspective of the way that rural spaces were being organized. Cows, after all, take up a lot of space, and it was beef that they wanted. One of the most active academies was the one in Belluno, where that big beech forest I showed you earlier was located. These academics knew better than to directly criticize the Venetian forestry regime, but many of their proposals, including an expansion of foddering crops, conflicted with the imperative to preserve the boundaries of forests. So they adopted a strategy for thinking about the relationship between time and landscape that undercut the various Venetian narratives. Cadastral surveys and other ways of quantifying forests are, from a management point of view, future-oriented. They're constructed around a vision of how forests will be used 10 years from now or 20 years from now. The academics in these mainland cities instead decided to time travel in the opposite direction, and they took those numbers and they didn't look back to 1600 or to 1569 or 1500, but they looked all the way back to antiquity. And many of them read classical sources such as Pliny the Younger, Horace, Virgil, and other Georgic poets for evidence of what the landscape had looked like under the Roman Empire. And the conclusions they drew from their readings were that in antiquity, arable land, cereal crops, had been more productive because of the integration of livestock into systems of agriculture. But they also concluded that forest cover had looked very different then than it did now. So contrary to the Venetian kind of political idea that they were keeping things just the way they were, if you just look back to antiquity, you'll clearly see, they said, that things are not, in fact, as they were. The implication here, and surprisingly, sorry, I missed a sentence, they concluded that, and they argued that there had been more forests in antiquity, but those forests had been less productive, and that the Venetians had outdone the ancients by doing more with less, so that the story is not one, as the forest cover shrank, it wasn't a story of decline, it was a story of triumph. We're doing more with less. The implication, not openly stated, was that agrarian reform, based on new techniques of scientific agriculture, make forestry, silviculture, would make it possible to do yet more with even less. And a new political economy was possible, they said, one grounded in an integrated system of agriculture and husbandry that would have profound implications for land ownership, agricultural technique, and the organization of rural labor and society. Antiquity was not a status quo ante to which they longed to return, right? So the Venetians wanted to keep the status quo, but rather it was a starting point or an index of what was actually possible. And I was largely unaware of these developments when I wrote the book, partially because, again, they didn't see, at least Venetians in Venice didn't see agriculture and forestry as related, but also because the historiography about them is incredibly dismissive the only a couple of Italian historians have written about them, and they say, oh, well, these were ineffectual spaces full of small town people performing their erudition. They weren't doing anything significant. And I took them at their word, but now I'm working on this current project on veterinary medicine, and the agrarian academies are actually central. And I can see that they were much more important than scholars had actually given them credit for. Connecting my current work with my older work on forests, I wonder now whether I missed something important, a countervailing discourse emanating from the mainland that sought to use the past not as a model for maintaining things, but instead as a model for reshaping the kind of future that the forest bureaucracy had so carefully crafted through pictures, words, and numbers. And so I conclude today by just saying that it doesn't matter so much how, even though how is in the title of the talk, it doesn't matter how they counted trees. It matters why. And that why was increasingly in question in the final decades of the Republic's existence. Thanks. So,
All right, Karl, thank you for that. Really appreciate sharing all that. One of
you want
the,
me to stop the share?
yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Although I will say one of the most asked questions during your presentation was, are we all seeing a white screen? So they were curious about why you were sharing and talking with the white screen.
Oh dear.
But it's fine. It's good.
Did you see it?
Yeah, the screen, yep, the screen was white. But there were,
Shoot.
no, I think when you were presenting, you started with a white screen, right? Blank screen.
Yeah.
And then you presented and talked a bit, and then you went into the maps and things, and that was great. Saw all that.
Okay.
And then towards the end there, you came back to the white screen.
I
People
came
were
back to
just
the white screen because my vision of these things is that sometimes if you leave the images up too long, they become a distraction.
That's great, and that is your pedagogical choice, and that's perfect. So, but all I'm saying is people were wondering if we were all seeing the
Okay,
same
sorry
thing.
about that.
No, not a problem. Um, I found it interesting. So the first question is we dive in here. We have a bunch, and about 10 or 12 minutes. Let's see how many we can get through. The I just can you remind us of the scale of the Venetian Republic? Because I think it's really interesting. You're talking about counting each tree. Obviously, if we were talking about a landmass the size of North America,
Can't be
so
done.
what? How big was the Venetian Republic, roughly?
How big was it? I don't have a square kilometers off the top of my head, but basically all of northeastern Italy today, basically from Bergamo, which is just to the east of it's very close to Milan, uh, across that whole strip, and then it included about half of the what's now the Croatian half of the Istrian Peninsula. The Slovenian half of the Istrian Peninsula was mostly controlled by the Habsburg Empire. So it was small. It was not at the scale of the British Empire or dwarfed by France, for example. So probably an area. If I'm trying to think about it in real terms, you know, California from Los Angeles down.
Okay. But I think even at that scale, the enormity of counting absolutely every tree, that's
No.
that's
So you
not an
have to really
easy,
want to do it. Like it's not
you
something
have to
that you
believe in it,
do.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you really have to believe in what you're doing.
Right. Okay. So some of the questions we're getting in, can you talk about what these Asian forests look like today? What is their status?
Oh, okay. Well,
Are they
that's
still there?
no. Well, some of them are. So the Cancillo, that big beech forest, it's a national park
Hmm.
today, and it more or less still has its historic boundaries. And one reason for that is that the terrain around it is so difficult that there was never any point in going in there and clearing it. And then the one way up high in the Alps, the Fur Reserve for Mass, that is also a national park. Um, the biggest oak forest, the Montello, is gone. And the reason it's gone is that the trench front in the First World War ran right through there and it
Mm,
was burned.
okay.
Or it might, in fact, still be there. So the kind of one of the curiosities is that, yeah, Venice gets conquered and so on, but the French don't come in and remake local legislation, and so a lot of the local legislation that you know set these boundaries was still in place, even though Venice no longer existed. And so, in this weird way, some parts were preserved as a snapshot. And there's even like 20th century litigation about that where they had to go back into the 16th century archive to recover kind of a common law understanding of why things looked the way they did.
Okay. Um, Here's a question about forest health. Have you
Hmm.
found evidence for early modern tree diseases, or does that seem to be a modern affliction?
Um, there's some evidence. They now, boy, I really have to reach back for this. One of the species they're concerned about is chestnut because they use it for some very specialized components on the ship. And there were references to some kind of blight there, but I didn't see any with respect to either, you know, uh, fir larch, the kind of, or to beech and oak. So you, I did see references to it, but they were really sparse.
Okay. One of our listeners is works with K through 12 educators and would like to use the wait, sorry, based works with K through 12 educators on forest-based education and would love to use some of these images as primary sources to show the origin of forest measurements. So
Yep.
just wondering if they're available anywhere. Is it in your book?
They're all in the book, actually.
Okay.
Everything I showed today is in the book.
Okay. Good. Can you talk about the technologies of understanding the wood volume within these boundaries? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah. So they don't think so. They don't think in terms of total volume. They think in terms uh, of the circumference or diameter, that the threshold for when it's useful to enter into production. But they record um, they record the circumference. They use a measurement called a foot that is actually pretty close to a current American foot. It's a Roman foot, but they record them in increments of a half a foot. So let's say 6 or 7 inches. It's all the way up to from 1 foot in circumference all the way up to whatever the biggest things are, and they make the decision about where to harvest, uh, in some cases on the basis of what they need them for. So if they need them for piles, they're going to look for something narrower. So they'll look in the survey book and said, okay, there's a lot
Mm,
of 3 or 4 footers there. If they're looking to make a lot of ships, they're going to look for the bigger ones because they can mill them into more planks. But they never come up with a total. I have spreadsheets where I kind of tried to rough it out, but they never talk about the height of the trees, only the circumference. So it's all an approximation.
okay, interesting. When you think about precision, it's interesting how yeah, how they measured things like that. So you kind of gave a narrative of decline, and was that
Well, that's
evident?
their story. Uh,
Okay, so the question though is would that be or could that be evidence of other areas of cultural life in Venice at that time? Was there a general sense of declension, or was it restricted to the fear of running out of timber?
Okay, so in the 18th century, they're worried about everything and the kind of it's the that's when political economy becomes a kind of uh, an academic uh, uh, whatever Adam Smith and all these kinds of things. So the coming out of this those ideas enter into this course and they start using those terms. They see the Venetian economy and political economy as in steep decline, linked to the loss of the value of their carrying trade with compared to that out in the Atlantic. And so they see themselves as in steep overall decline. And so the agrarian reforms that are proposed that I talked about right at the end are meant to kind of address this. And it's sadly, it's a little bit too on the nose now, but it's like pure 18th century mercantilism. We're going to make Venice great again by stopping imports. So they become obsessed with meat because almost all of their meat comes on the hoof from Hungary. And so there's like, well, if we can just make more cows, we won't have this, they say it, this trade deficit with the imperials. And so they're attempting to kind of remake the economy into an economy that is a producer economy that exports rather than an economy that's based on throughput of the carrying trade. And so that infects everything. But that's an 18th century. That starts late 17th century. That infects everything that they say. But before that, there's like really the two issues that they worry about. Is the lagoon going to fill up with dirt? Are they going to become terrestrialized? And are they going to run out of wood? Those are like the worries. But then in the 18th century, it becomes kind of a global crisis as they see it.
Okay. So this question kind of relates to that, and it's looking at the ethos or the culture that was alive in Venice at that time. How much of that static methodology of management has carried into current day? Is this something that is ingrained into the culture and relationship between people and forest or people and nature?
So I'm the wrong person to ask that question to. There's actually a guy at the University of Turin, Giacomo Bonan, who works on 19th century forestry. But what I would say is that people who work on modern landscapes, so Dario Gaggio, he's at Michigan, Bonan, Parinello, there's a bunch of these guys. One of the things that they show is that unsurprisingly, the 19th century Italian state, once it becomes after 58 becomes a unified. Venice is the last part to get integrated. Once it becomes a unified nation state, it sets out to squelch local practices, to create a uniform, modernized national culture of agriculture, of land management, and also, so Bonan's work, they want to modernize forestry, and the way they do it is so the creators of the unified Italian state were mostly from Piedmont, so the Northwest. They were francophones, they weren't Italophones, and so they import models from France and then try to kind of import. And then a lot of the historians who were working at that time kind of reinforce that, because they paint a picture of early modern agriculture on the Italian peninsula as being hopelessly retrograde, stuck in a kind of serfdom. There's this system of labor, corvée labor, called the mezzadria. And they say, well, Italy was backwards. So by the time, unification happens in the 19th century, all of those older practices are associated with a kind of primitive economy that they are setting out to modernize.
Mm.
And then that's the landscape of Under the Tuscan Sun is that modernized landscape, not the traditional landscape. That's the kind
Right.
of irony of, but yeah, so no, some of the laws sort of remain in place in some places, but the practices become the standard practices of modern forestry. And uh, um, White, Man in Nature, uh, he wrote that on a trip to Italy. So
Mm.
it becomes a kind of you get this universalizing discourse of how things
Right.
should be managed.
All right, Karl, we're going to have to leave it there. That was terrific. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and sharing the history of Venice. Many of the things and areas where you kind of wrapped up the discussion is we're going to further explore and go beyond next semester. So we'll save that further discussion for the fall. But with that, Karl, thank you so much. I really appreciate your
I
time.
I so happy you have no I mean what I said at the beginning is true. Like it's sort of I've always thought, oh, Yale Forest School, I'd really like to give a talk there someday.
Oh,
So
there you go.
close the circle for me. So I was really thrilled.
All right. Thanks, Karl. And as this is the end of the series, I have a few things I'd like to do to wrap up. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also going to give everybody some information about what's next. But again, apologies for folks that have submitted questions we weren't able to get to. As you can see, there's a lot to share and a lot to discuss. And we get through as many questions as we can. So I'd like to thank some folks. And first off, I'd like to thank all the speakers that we've had over the last 4 months. I think you'll see a slide there that reminds you of all the great speakers that we had. We've learned so much from all of them. So excited that they were able to join us. Grateful for everybody's enthusiasm and thoughtfulness when we're thinking and talking through the history of the global forest. So thanks to all of our speakers, and a reminder to everybody that's interested, all the speakers' talks are available on the Yale Forest Forum website. So check them out. If you missed somebody or if you want to relive one of the talks, please check it out on Yale Forest Forum website. And I'd love to thank our series facilitators and hosts, Tanya Moons and the Forest History Society. It's the first time that we've collaborated with Tanya and the Forest History Society, and it's been terrific. Really, really fun and interesting. So looking forward to more collaboration there. And of course, our longtime partner, Mark Ashton with the Forest School and the Yale School of the Environment. There will be more coming from this series, so more to do with those folks. I'd also like to thank the folks on the Yale Forest Forum side. Special thanks to Jane Dowd. Jane just joined us. She's the new administrator here at the Forest School, working a lot or primarily on Yale Forest Forum and related activities. I think, and I hope you all join me in thinking that Jane did a wonderful job picking this up really quickly and ensuring that this series and everything else that we're working on has run really smoothly. So thank you so much to Jane and you all that have joined these series. You'll be hearing more from Jane. Also, a special thanks to Sarah Santiago for promoting the series and supporting it in many different ways here at the school. One of the things that Sarah spends time on is editing the series publication, the YFF review. So we have a few reviews from the last couple series coming out soon, and we will let you all know when those are available. So I think that's Tribal Forestry very soon, and Old Growth, the Old Growth series that we did last fall. And I think, as some of you know, but maybe many don't, we have a seminar that we run in conjunction with these webinar series. So we have master students that take that webinar series, and we're fortunate that the speakers give extra time to talk with our students and further these discussions. I'd also like to note that these students are also current students are working with the Forest History Society to write blogs about some of the key takeaways, historical takeaways, of course, from this webinar series. And I think for those that are interested, hopefully Tanya or Jane can put the link to the Forest History Society blogs in the chat. So check those out. I think the students' blogs will be coming out probably within the next weeks or months, not months, because it is the final assignment and we're wrapping up. And finally, I want to thank all of you. We've had over 2,800 registrants to the series. And we're so happy that you all had the opportunity to attend throughout the last 4 months. And we hope that you've benefited and hope that these presentations and discussions have contributed to your thinking around the history of forest, people, and forestry. Now, as I said before, I want to talk about what's next for the Yale Forest Forum. So next fall, we have 2 webinar series that we are going to put forward. They will both start in late August. So I think the last week of August, we will launch the series. The first series that I'll share is going to be a continuation of this one. So it's a continuation of our global exploration of the history of forestry. This time we're going to look at the development of so-called scientific forestry, its relationship to the Industrial Revolution, how the profession of forestry evolved over this period, and its regional impacts on forest and people. This series will again be in collaboration with Tanya Moons and the Forest History Society, but this time we'll also be working with Terry Baker and the Society of American Foresters to host the series. So look forward to the registration information. It'll be coming your way very soon. And again, that will be on Thursdays this fall. Our second fall series will meet on Tuesdays and will advance our previous 2 series on the issue of forest carbon. So if you're into forest carbon or wondering what's going on with forest carbon, this series is for you. So in the fall, we'll examine why purchases of forest carbon credits have stalled and how to ensure they represent real and conservatively estimated avoided emissions or atmospheric CO2 removal. So this is going to be the latest information with the latest actors working in this sector. The series is going to be led by Sarah Kibbing. Sarah is Director of Research of the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program and the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. She's also a very frequent host of the Yale Forest Forum, so many of you know and recognize Sarah. Looking forward to that series as well. You're going to hear more from us on the new series. Registration for both will be open shortly. It's not open yet, so hang on, but we will send you that information for registration very shortly. You'll be able to do it through the Yale Forest Forum website, or we will send you a link via email. For anybody who's registered to the YFFs in the past or currently will get an email with the information of the new series. So a lot more to come from the Yale Forest Forum. Very exciting, very exciting. Finally, and as always, if you're looking for CEUs from this or the previous speakers, stay on and read the instructions and follow them and let us know. So finally, thanks everybody. That's it for me and the Yale team here. So take care.